Can you get a car that actually runs good and makes a great work car for $400? This guy seemed to have done it. And yes, it's missing a few side molding, and the bottom of the bumper here is held on with a zip tie. And the seller didn't tell him until he got there that, well, the interior was kind of gutted, but really, that makes for carrying things a lot easier. You can put all kinds of stuff in here. There's a lot of space in there now. Hey, this could be an Outback special. But hey, all 4 doors still work. And sure, the paint's faded away a little, but it is a Honda. Here we go. This guy owns a lot of Hondas. Starts right up. And sure, the airbag system doesn't work anymore, but the seat belts do, and they work perfectly fine. And this is Tennessee, so we got a CB radio here. Now, this thing does have 377,832 miles on it, but listen to the engine. It's just humming along. These Honda engines. Honda, really, is probably the best mass production company for engines in the world. All that mileage, is it clanging and clacking? No, it isn't. The only noise you really heard was the cold air intake, because when you put them on, it will make a car noisier. That's why a lot of guys do it. It will make more sound that way. The box in most cars, the air box, is also to keep cars quiet. Most people want quiet cars, but with these Hondas, a lot of guys soup them up. Now, granted, this battery came from another car. He paid $125 for that entire car, and this battery came in it. So he put this in his driving car. That's one of the big advantages of Hondas. You got choice of so many parts. There are so many interchangeable things you can get. You can always go to a salvage yard and you can have fun and don't have to spend much money. Not only do Honda parts fit Hondas, they fit some other cars too. Now, how can these things last so long? Well, you know how? Check out the sticker. Made in Japan by Honda Motor Company. And sure, back then, the Japanese, maybe they weren't so hot at painting cars. This BMW, the same year. Kind of a difference in the paint there. Now, this little bitty engine may only have 102 horsepower and a whopping 98 pound-feet of torque. You rev them up in a light car like this, they're still fun to drive. Now, of course, this is a work car, and as a work car, you're not going to be doing drag racing in it. You really don't care. It's going to get you where you're going. It's going to be ultra dependable, even with all this mileage on it, because it's a Honda. Now, back in the day when I was a young mechanic, people would say, I'm not buying one of them foreign cars. You can't get parts for them. Ha! Let's say the starter breaks on this. Well, one, it's a standard transmission, so you can push start it anyways if you have to. But you can go to any AutoZone. Odds are they'll have a starter sitting on the shelves to hand to you. They're not hard to get parts for. They don't cost much. This is like the ultimate $400 transportation car. Not just like, oh, it's a stopgap. I'll buy this. Maybe it'll last me a couple of months. This thing might last another 10 years. Who knows? And of course, if you want to go crazy, you could take the shell and you could soup it all up. You could do whatever you wanted. You could put another engine, a supercharger, and have a real sleeper car, because they're set up that if you change the suspension, a little bigger engine, it would be one screaming car. But in this case, it's a transportation car. This thing can run all over the place, and it still gets 40 miles a gallon if you want to drive on a highway. But just normal driving, you get 30, 32 miles a gallon in the thing. Hey, you can't argue with that. The owner just told me the best gas mileage he ever got, he was driving Texas to Tennessee. He was doing about 90 miles an hour, and he calculated it when he filled it up, going back and forth, that he got 42 miles a gallon, going 90 miles an hour. They have these things really well built. There's no arguing that. I mean, let's face the facts. Would you buy a $400 car and drive it 90 miles an hour from Texas to Tennessee and back? It obviously did it. Here's the proof. It's sitting right here. And you're certainly not going to attract the police's attention in this thing. It's not a red screaming or orange or yellow sports car. Let's take it for a spin. Starts right up. It even makes it up hills. Look at this. Now, what shocks me is, even in the twisties, this thing still handles good, and it really doesn't ride all that bad. Listen to it go. All those miles It's still got guts in it. Here it goes from a standing start. Not bad for a $400 car, is it? This is still a fun country driving car. Take it out, have a little fun. You can't beat it for $400. Okay, now comes the big question. Yes, it's a $400 car. But how long is a $400 car gonna last? He bought it for $400 3 years ago. And you just went for a ride in this thing. You hear how it still hums. Don't think it's, oh, well, you know, oh, it might last a couple weeks. Hey, sometimes when I rented a car in Boston at the airport to visit my son there, I had to pay $700 to rent a car for 5 days. This thing's gonna go for 3 years for $400. And has it broken down? Well, truthfully, it broke down once. The distributor stopped sending fire. It broke. It's typical on these. Oh, and it's such a hard job to change. Here's the distributor. You know, there's a bolt here, here, and here. That's it. What did the owner do? He went to an O'Reilly. It's an old car, right? Guess what? They had a brand new one in stock for about $165. He didn't even have to order it. You get a mass-produced car that's as well made as a Honda. They're still extremely dependable transportation. Okay, Pontiac Fiero. People laughed them as joke cars. 1988, the last year they made them. This is a very special one. Now, the original four-banger had a whopping 92 horsepower. And if you went up to their top-of-the-line V6, you could get 144. Unfortunately, most of them were made with the 4 cylinders with an automatic transmission. They couldn't get out of their own way. They had a top speed of 102, but you basically had to be going downhill for that. But this is a bird of a different feather. This has had a 3800 engine put in with a supercharger, custom-made header and exhaust, and this is what it sounds like. Been built up, and it was built up really well, but all things considered, it's a fun car that you don't have to put a ton of money in. He bought it years ago for $5,000. This one puts out 310 at the wheel, not at the crank, at the wheel. Now, one of the big problems of the original Fieros was a lot of them started on fire. The reason they started on fire is because they had little bitty 4-cylinder engines with 92 horses, and being a sporty car with a mid-engine design, guys would drive them hard, and then they'd throw a rod, knock a hole in the engine, the oil would get on the exhaust, start a fire, and woof, up they'd go. And a lot of them had overheating problems for 2 reasons. One, if some idiot jacked it up and jacked it on the coolant tubes, because realize your engine's in the back but the radiator's in the front, and if you crush those tubes, you're not going to get coolant, your engine's going to overheat, and plus, if you know the average American, they don't do much maintenance. So, since these have the cool wedged front, the radiator's got to be canted at an angle. They have cooling fans that work quite well when the fans work. But, being a GM product, if the fans stopped working, the engines would overheat and kaput. It wasn't the car's fault. That's more of a maintenance thing. But still, since Americans don't maintain things that well, didn't really jive that well with public who had an image of, oh, they're hardly built cars. But that said, they sold 370,000 of these in a 5-year period they made them. You want to compare it with Toyota MR2, which people like, being a Toyota, same period of time, they sold less than 170,000 of them. So these way outsold those. They're both mid-engine cars, and really, if you wanted to have some fun, especially if you had the D-Trag standard transmission, even with a little 92 horsepower, you could still have some fun. It's a light car. It's a composite body. Now, it still has steel frames, so there's plenty of support in it. And speaking of steel frames, if you're going to buy one of these used, you don't have to worry about rust in the composite, but you do in the frame. This one's got a totally clean frame, but if you live up north, check that frame if you're buying one. If it's rusted, run away. Don't even think about it. You'd have to restore the whole thing and put too much money in it. No, even I have to say, come on, it's an old car, but it's still sharp looking. There's no arguing that. It was the shape of things to come, the wedge shape. And it was the first mid-engine car that GM had built since like 1938. So really, it wasn't that bad of an idea. But there was one gigantic problem with these cars, and that's called capitalism. Over the period that these things were made, it's been estimated that GM lost on average about $2,000 per car selling these things. So if you're losing money making a car, it just doesn't make any sense. So their bad reputation up north, yes, they're probably all rusted away, but here in Tennessee, if you find them and they're not rusted, you could have a great sleeper car. The owner of this, when you consider the lightweight and the 305 horsepower of the rear wheels, he can blow Mustangs away. They think, oh, it's a Fiero, you know? He'd have to be kind of quiet though, because that sound, it doesn't sound like a Fiero. It does sound more like a Mustang. They don't know, and they pull up to him, he can just blow the doors off him in this thing. And yeah, he's got some money invested in it, but overall, with the car and everything he added in, $18,000, what's that today? You can't even get a new Toyota Corolla for $18,000. And it's certainly a blast from the past, but I like the pop-up headlights. They give it a little bit of class. You know, now everything is all plastic, wrap around, you name it. Hey, things had more style back in the day. And you really can't beat that emblem. It has class. Take it for a spin. Now the interesting thing here, as you can see, is it's all stock. It looks totally like a normal Fiero. And isn't it fun to fool people? It's still got the original tape deck with auto reverse. Ooh, what technology. As you can see, when you step on the gas, and yes, it stays in a straight line too. It's got a decent suspension system on it. Didn't get squirrely. The engine, transmission all in the back. Got good handling characteristics. Mind you, with all the horsepower this thing has, the front end does have a tendency of popping up while the back goes down. Considering that the front end weighs 800 pounds, but the rear weighs 1,400 pounds. Not the perfect weight ratio like in a Porsche. I mean, this is kind of the American poor man's Porsche. Now, if you want to just take off from a little rolling start here, you can see that the front end does pop up a little bit with all that power in the back. I have to say, it is a regular Fiero. You can hear things rattling while you go down the road. It kind of gives it that little bit of hominess and reality that you're in a GM product, knowing that things will rattle. And all that power, normally you think it's going to come at a big cost. This insurance is only $250 a year because it's a classic car. You get a classic car, you can get low insurance on it. I got customers with vets, the same thing. And some of them have a limitation, you can only drive them 5,000 miles a year, but hey, that's still a lot of miles, you know? You're not buying a car like this and going cross country, that's not what it's for. And on a cold day like today, you got your vents letting the heat come out. These had a lot of interesting designs for them. They were really ahead of their time. And here's the funny part as far as I'm concerned. If Pontiac themselves would have built ones like this, they probably would have sold like hotcakes. A mid-engine car with this kind of grunt. There's a big difference between this with 305 at the wheel and 92 horsepower at the crank. Those things were putting out barely 80 to the wheels. This is a lot of fun. The other ones, yeah, little turdy things going around, didn't have enough power to pull themselves from here to there. But you don't have to go this insane. Maybe do a little bit of tuning on it, and they're still fun to drive around. And truth be told, you can get these things dirt cheap. Say the only thing you can find are four bangers. So take that out, throw it away, put a V8 engine in. You can do whatever you want, since you can get engines like these 3800s in junkyards all over the place. You're not going to get a blueprinted one like this, putting 310 horsepower to the wheels, but you can get ones that run pretty good when you consider you got a full-size Buick running with a 3800 and you put it in this little car. It's a lot of power, and the 3800s are one of the most dependable, if not the most dependable V6 engine that GM ever put out. And really, when you check it out, it may be 1988, but it's pretty much a classic style. It has nice lines. Since it's got a composite body, you don't have to worry about rust. And for you Japanese car aficionados, it was a Japanese engineer who was the head of the project. Close your eyes, open them again. You can see a lot of Nissan in these if you look closely enough. And I'm not talking modern Nissan, I'm talking back in the day when they were called Datsun. And they made excellent little sports cars. This thing, with a little teasing when they came out with it in the first place, if they wouldn't have put those underpowered engines in them. But the way that I read they put into the sales was it's going to be a commuter car for women. And they didn't think they wanted the speed and that. Well, let me tell you something. They don't know much about women. Women like speed just as much as men do. And you give them a little 92 horsepower thing with an automatic transmission. Hey, they weren't happy with it either. If they would have just put in decent 3800s in them all, hey, they could have become extremely popular. But of course today, I mean, everybody's into the SUVs or trucks where they make most of their profit. Sports cars and sporty cars, a lot of people like them, but that's not where the markets go. So most companies aren't interested in making the sports cars, and of course, Pontiac doesn't even exist as a brand anymore. But of course, if you know anything about history, that's because GM went bankrupt, took a bunch of government money. One of the deals with the government was you have to become profitable, so they cut Pontiac off entirely. They stopped making those Holdens, which were cool cars. They stopped later in Australia, but they stopped selling the Pontiac G8s over here, and they weren't bad cars either. But when you go bankrupt and you gotta pay the piper, it was cut costs, and that was one of the ways they cut costs, was by axing Pontiac, which is really a shame because these little cars can be an awful lot of fun. Take advantage of it. You can have an awful lot of fun for a little bit of dollars. You don't have to put $100,000, $200,000 in. You can get these things cheap and do whatever you want, whenever you want. Maybe you want to put a supercharger in it, or maybe you want to be super cheap and put in a 4 that it came with and just tootle around. If it's a standard transmission, let's say you never drive over 80 miles an hour, you won't care. It'd be fun, great gas mileage. I mean, you can do whatever you want with one of these cars relatively cheaply. There's a whole bunch of them in junkyards. Like I said, they sold a whole bunch of them. Compared to the Toyota, they sold almost 3 times as many as the MR2s. And there's a lot of them in junkyards that you can get all kinds of parts dirt cheap. People are always asking me about Scions. Are they good cars or bad cars? Well, I'm going to give you the whole rundown on Scions now. This is a 2011 Scion Tc. Now, it's been through the washing machine. The man who owns it drives like a maniac, gets road rage all the time. And the only one problem it had was the engine blew up. But you can't blame the car. He got road rage in it going 80 miles an hour, and he inadvertently downshifted into first gear. Of course, the engine blew up. They can't rev that high. So we had to put a used engine in it, but it runs great now. Now, they don't make Scions anymore. A lot of people say, oh, you don't make a car anymore, it's a bad car, don't buy it. Completely wrong in the case of Scion. Toyota just decided, for some bizarre reason, that young people don't like Toyota, so we'll make their own brand and call them Scion. Now, I understood why they made Lexus, because most people are like, oh, who's going to pay $50,000, $60,000 for a Toyota, so we'll make fancy ones and call them Lexus. That I understand. But why would you want to low brand a Toyota to sell it to young people and call it Scion? It just didn't make any sense to me. But they did, and Toyota marketed the heck out of them years ago. You could see music stores, there'd be a bunch of young people there, and they have music blaring, giving them free Scion test rides and stuff. They marketed the heck out of them. And they are actually pretty good cars. Take the Scion Tc, for example. It originally was a $19,000 car. It's got a nice 6-speed transmission, a zippy 4-cylinder Toyota engine. For that price, you were really getting your money's worth. And at that price, you were even getting these 18-inch wheels with the fancy alloy wheels on them. These things were a real bargain. Check under the hood. Metal. This isn't a plastic Hulk like the new ones. For your money, you actually got a metal engine set up. It's all metal, it's not plastic junk. Now you can see, this does have junkyard writing because this is a used engine. As I said, you can't blame the car, that was the driver. Road rage to go 80 miles an hour and downshift into first gear. You can do that in just about any car and it's gonna blow the engine up. Didn't hurt the transmission though, it still works perfectly fine. And of course, this is a sport version. A lot of people bought those boxy Scions if they didn't mind a boxy vehicle. They were quick little vehicles too. I still don't understand why Toyota gave them a different name. I mean, didn't sell them as Toyotas, because that's what they're doing now. They no longer make Scions, but they make the same cars. They just call them Toyotas instead. So even though they don't make them anymore, it's no problem getting parts for these things. They're all Toyota parts. They're not all that expensive. These are fun cars to drive around in. Why, oh why, they decided to make a different brand name for them and then cut it out is beyond me. But obviously it has to do with sales. 2006 was the high point of Scions. They sold over 173,000 in the United States. But 2016, they only sold 12,000. The numbers just weren't there, so they decided to ditch the whole Scion experiment. So these Scions are part of a relatively rare phenomenon. A solid, well-built vehicle that failed. People didn't buy enough of them. Now, some of it just has to do with it's a two-door sedan. Two-door sedans in the United States are becoming less and less popular. Everyone wants an SUV with 4 doors and lots of space. That's one reason they went out. And this particular one is a 6-speed standard transmission. 93% of Americans don't even drive standards anymore. So there's a market that they're not selling to. As you can see inside, they're pretty snazzy. Got some nice chrome, black, nice instrument panel. Even got the face mask here. It's got the dual sunroof set up on it. And when we check the back, as you can see, it's a 2-door, but there's a reasonable amount of room in the back. It's not bad at all. And we go to the back, you can see it's got a pretty serious trunk. It's a hatch. The seats can move down. You can get a lot of room in these things. Once you empty all that stuff out and put them down, you can carry plywood, whatever you want. They're very utilitarian for a hatchback. Now this particular one's got 180 horsepower and hooked up to a 6-speed standard. It's really quick. If you were insane enough, they offered a TRD supercharger kit that would bump it all close to 300 horsepower. You want to soup them up, you could soup them up, but they're plenty fast the way they are. They're not slow cars. They handle quite well. As I say, my customer that owns this gets road rage, is a little too wild, you know. He also has a Harley Davidson that he drives, so he's a little bit on the wild side. But this thing, amazingly enough, has held up. He had a Honda before he had this, and the Honda didn't hold up as well as this. The transmission was going out on the Honda because it couldn't take his driving. This transmission has no problems at all, even though he drives like a maniac. As you can see, it's a very quiet car just sitting here, and we'll see how it takes off. It's got some power to it. You can feel the bumps, but it's a sports car. This is a luxury limousine. It's made to handle, and those big 18-inch wheels hold the road well, but they're not made for a smooth ride. And as usual, ice-cold air conditioning, even though it's old. So as you can see, it's actually a pretty high-performance little car. If you ask me, they pretty much made a perfect little coupe. And for 19,000 bucks, that isn't much scratch. Take a Honda Civic Type R, great little race car. Hey, you're going to pay 40-something grand for those things. Not $19,000 when they were brand new. And even though this thing's 10 years old, it's still real stylish. It's not something that goes out of style. It's a nice looking car. It's very aerodynamic. They're actually very handy cars. But with everybody having this big excitement for SUVs these days, a lot of sedans and coupes, they're just not making anymore. Honda just said that they're not going to be making their Civic sedan anymore. They look at what they're selling, make what they sell. The ones that don't sell well, they just drop them. Toyota just decided to drop the entire line of Scion. They still make the same basic vehicles, they just give them a different name. Toyota had such a good reputation. I can understand American car manufacturers like Dodge. They don't make Dodge Rams anymore. They make Rams. They have their own name. They want to distance themselves from Fiat Chrysler as much as possible. Why would you want to distance yourself from Toyota when you're selling quality cars? Especially to young people. They knew Toyotas were good. They grew up with that. Why would you make something else? I don't know. Somebody had a little brain fart going on there. And I guess if you look at it, Toyota's never really been a sports car company. They make money selling regular cars, and with their Lexus division, luxury cars and SUVs to people. They were never a real sports car company. Look at their Supras now. They're just rebadged BMWs. Their other sports cars, they're just rebadged Subarus made by Subaru. That's not in their business. And I guess they just decided, they don't really need to make this little Scion sports car anymore. But they're great cars. If you can find a good used one and get a good price on one, hey, that could be a killer of a deal. And this one is a 6-speed standard, and since 90-something% of Americans drive automatics, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the automatics. They are extremely dependable transmissions that they put in the automatic Scions. I have customers have 350,000 miles with the original automatic transmission in a Scion, and they still shift perfectly fine. And the only thing they did was change the fluid every 50, 60,000 miles. They are low maintenance cars, just like Toyotas. And as I said, even if you're gonna buy a used one and they don't make them anymore, there's no problem getting parts for them. It's not like you're buying a Yugo and you can't get parts for it. You know, it's a Toyota. Plenty of parts are interchangeable. And there's such an aftermarket too for them. You can go to places like AutoZone, get brake pads. That's what I'm doing now, putting brake pads on. Where did they come from? AutoZone. You know, I mean, you can get parts cheaply enough for these that work perfectly fine. Don't worry about unavailability of parts or Scions, because they're still readily available. So now you know the truth about Scions. You can't buy a new one because they don't make them anymore, but if you're looking at a good used one, it could be a fantastic deal. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.